Hello, and well, welcome to something a little bit different. This is a video I've been wanting to make for quite a while now, because there's quite a lot I want to say about the current state of Steel Division 2's general balance and gameplay. After seeing Nilla's video, which definitely inspired me a little bit to talk about the current issues, Nilla's video will be in the link in the description below. It's a pretty good video, I highly recommend it. He has some pretty good points, but I want to expand a little bit more on, well, just how Steel Division 2 generally plays currently right now at the end of August in 2019 and the general balance. I want to use this video as a discussion point for everyone down below to voice their opinions, and you feel free to disagree with anything that I say within this video. But I really want to talk about it, since I think it's one current major issue of the game, and there's a bunch of smaller issues that really lead up into that major issue. So with enough rambling out the way, let's just get right into it. So what is this major issue that you're hinting about, Rang? Well, it's a simple one, and that being that the game really is just spam for the most part. And what I mean by spam is that the majority gameplay tactic that you want to be doing and you're encouraged to do is to just have a larger amount of forces than your enemy and use that to overwhelm the enemy frontline, push, attack, etc. Now, this is kind of historically accurate. I mean, you usually win fights and wars by having more dudes than the other guy, that's not wrong. But there's less room for actual tactical movement and decision making in Steel Division 2 compared to previous Eugene system games. Over the past few months, the current casts and replays that I've been seeing really all fall into the same sort of gameplay loop, where it's all about usually medium tank spam, lots of cheap infantry spam, just regular riflemen. Off-map artillery is also currently very popular in 1v1s, and I'm seeing less and less of this core maneuver warfare. I've seen it sometimes every now and again, but it just feels like you just have two people just pretty much smashing in the middle, just in a head-on back and forth like a tug of war, until one side eventually breaks due to just running out of cards. And there's many reasons for this, and the first one being is generally the availability and the veterancy. So, if you played Steel Division 2, you might notice you can get a lot of units in a battle. The availability on cards is pretty high. I mean, the obvious example is that with some infantry squads in C phase unvetted, you can get 27 to 36 in a single card, and of course some medium tank cards, especially with Russian T-3476s, you can get a lot of units. Now, just generally having a lot of units isn't necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't dumb down the game in a standard sense, but currently in how the game is set up and played, it definitely is a little bit overwhelming in a micro and macro sense. Steel Division 2 is very weird when it comes to micro and macro, because on one hand, it's not very micro-intensive, and it's not very macro-intensive, but at the same time, it is. It's not like Company of Heroes or StarCraft, where units have different individual unit abilities, which you have to use at specific times to get the most out of your unit. Usually, you maybe get a smoke grenade or so with a unit in Steel Division. There's no real active abilities. But at the same time, your unit positioning and rail moving them and how you have them coordinated in your force matters a lot. Having your flamethrower team in the perfect building to ambush guys as they come up into the town and go around a specific street can really mean whether you keep hold of that town or you lose the town. Of course, a classic example of trying to dodge enemy grenades and satchel charges of infantry is another good point of the micro gameplay in SD2. But at the same time, you have the larger macro gameplay, where you have a lot of units under your control. And yes, those small unit engagements matter, but you also have to worry about the grander scheme of things of controlling your entire front line, and especially in 1v1s where you have 8 kilometers of front line, that's a lot of rail front you have to cover. Now, to be fair to Eugene, they have done a pretty good job in trying to relieve the micro issue with the whole Smart Order commander system, and frankly, it's a pretty good system for the most part. I like it quite a lot, but it's not perfect. It works well with infantry and tanks that you don't really care too much about, as well as artillery, but we'll get to that later. But for a lot of other things, such as static gun emplacements and whatnot, it's usually a little bit dumb. Usually, I feel like most players avoid using the system, not because it's terribly a bad system, but just doing general attack moves works just as well when micro and infantry and tanks. And especially for newer players, I think the larger scale of the game can definitely be a little bit overwhelming with the amount of forces that are available to you. Of course, with people who are, more experienced with the game, and especially experienced with previous Eugene games, I've kind of gotten used to the whole Eugene system of, how units work and maneuver about and having to micro them, positioning them, etc. But there's a lot of units you have to micro and cover at all times, and with how disjointed it feels like, with how you have to worry about small micro engagements, or also having to worry about large macro engagements, you can't really just focus on one or the other, it's trying to do both. But it also doesn't help that the game really encourages you to try to take the most amount of units that you can in your deck building, because frankly, veterancy in the deck building part of the game is for the most part utterly worthless, because you lose so much availability on higher veterancy. And let me give you an example. So, with a lot of B-phase airplane cards, the veterancy curve goes that you get 4 of them unvetted, 2 of them with 1-star veterancy, and a single one with 2-star veterancy, which is pretty harsh in my mind. Now, a 2-star vetted airplane is a pretty scary thing, and same with most 2-star vetted units. With airplanes, rather, they get the extra agility bonus, which means they are a much better dogfighter if we're talking about a fighter plane, for example. Because of veterancy, it increases the offensive capabilities of units, but not so much the defensive. So that 2-star fighter plane will die roughly just the same compared to an unvetted one for the most part. Yes, they do take a lot less suppressive damage, which does help out, but if you make a wrong move, or the enemy brings out 4 unvetted interceptor planes to chase you down, I mean, you're pretty much dead. So in a scenario like that, you're pretty much just wanting to take unvetted planes because you're going to want the availability, because how lethal ST2 gameplay can be, you just really need numbers to replace when your units die. But here's the thing, not all units have a terrible availability curve like that. A really good example of what I think is an ideal availability curve is with the Stugs. The majority of Stugs in game have an availability curve in A phase of you get 5 of them unvetted, 4 of them with 1-star veterancy, and then 3 of them with 2-star veterancy. This is much more generous compared to the airplane scenario where essentially every veterancy step you're losing half the airplanes. Here you're just losing 1 in B phase 2 units every time you go up a veterancy curve. Having 3 2-star Stugs is definitely nice, and you can definitely get out that extra firepower with those 3 Stugs compared to having 5 unvetted Stugs, and you're also getting a better bang for your buck, because the Stugs will cost the same, but the 2-star ones, they're gonna be much better for the price, but they still die relatively quickly compared to regular Stugs that are unvetted, because they don't get magically any extra armor. So you still have to micro them effectively, but you can't just throw them away like with unvetted Stugs. And I think his veterancy problem definitely amplifies how the game is spam, because everyone is always taking unvetted units for the most part. There's not many reasons to take vetted units. But also, there's no reason to really take high veterancy, is because of the commander system. Overall, I actually really like the commander system. The commander system being is that in support tab, you can take a commander, sets up a whole chain of command, and any unit within that commander aura essentially gets 2-star veterancy bonus instead of a regular 1-star veterancy bonus. It's really cool. It does a pretty good job of simulating the chain of command and actual warfare, and you also have this fun little mini-game of trying to connect the dots and set up an effective chain of command along a large front line. But with how it's currently set up, considering that you get an extra 2-star veterancy bonus for pretty much just having to buy a unit, it makes buying actual vetted units in the actual deck building system worthless, because you can just bump up any unit to 2-star veterancy and increase their firepower exponentially. I mean, recently in patches, they've actually nerfed the price of infantry commanders, because in 1v1, you had a go-to thing, as in a town fight, having an extra 2-star veterancy helps out quite a bit. But also, it's completely worthless taking 2-star vetted units at all with this system, because a 2-star vetted unit isn't going to get a bonus from the commander, while a 1-star vetted unit will be able to go to 3-star veterancy, just like with a 2-star vetted unit. It's a lot of stars. You might be having a little bit of stars in your eyes in this conversation. But the point I'm trying to get across is that veterancy, for the most part, it's worthless in its current state. really they should be a bit more gentler with the veterancy curve. If going back to my airplane example, in my personal opinion, what it really should be is that you get 4 of them unvetted, 3 of them with 1-star veterancy, and 2 of them with 2-star veterancy. You're still getting half the airplanes with the 2 stars compared to the unvetted, but you can make it work. What also doesn't help in regards to spam gameplay is the maps. Now, like with many things in this video, I'm rather conflicted about the general balance and layout of the maps. Because on one hand, some of Steel Division's 2 maps are some of the best maps that Eugene has done in any of their games. Aesthetically speaking, no, I'm not a huge fan of the color palette, but in terms of the actual layout, the design, the small little details, it's really cool, but also just the general layout and balance of maps. There's a lot of very good 1v1 maps, for example, such as Orsa North and Orsa East. Yes, they're pretty much symmetrical, but symmetrical maps aren't necessarily bad. But on the other hand, there's a lot of really bad maps that encourage really boring choke point gameplay, such as Bob Orr, which is essentially just a bunch of bridge fights, and bridge fights, in my personal opinion, aren't that fun, because you're just fighting over a narrow bridge choke point. And then you got that other terrible map which no one plays, because it's been removed from the rank roster, with, you know, I mean, I have a picture on the screen of the actual name on so I remember it, but it's just the big bloody town fight in the middle where you just kind of have this terrible little Stalingrad for an hour until one side runs out of infantry. But it's not just the general layout of some maps which are problematic, it's also the size of maps, because how the game plays in 1v1 is pretty different to how the game plays in team games. This has always been the case somewhat with like Wargame and SD44, but in SD2 it feels quantifiably different. And it's really just due to the width of the map, the amount of frontline that you have to cover. So for example, in a 1v1, the maps for just a single player, it's pretty large. They're 8 kilometers wide, for example. And in that 8 kilometers, you're going to have to defend and attack on that entire front line yourself. And frankly, you cannot reasonably set up an effective defensive position across that entire front line. But here's the thing, the enemy can't either. So 1v1s on well-balanced maps, are actually fun to play, usually become this very interesting game of attack and defend, where you're trying to break through the enemy weak point as you try to probe at different sections of the map to try and find that weak point and then make a breakthrough. But at the same time, the enemy's doing the same thing to you. So you're trying to rush up units that you're, making through your little battle of the bulge, while the enemy's also doing the same thing and also trying to set up a scratch defense, which leads to hectic gameplay with maneuver warfare and attack and defense. It's honestly really cool when it actually works. But then on the other hand, once you get to 2v2s and 3v3s and 4v4s, the maps themselves do get larger, but the amount of map coverage gets worse for individual players. What I mean by this is that once you get into a 4v4 map, for example, I mean, not everyone's going to play over the same map equally. Everyone usually just divides the map into sectors where each player is assigned to. That's generally how it goes for the most part. And once you divide up the map into 4 quadrants, each quadrant is smaller than a 1v1 map, which, I mean, it always has been the case in previous games, but in Steel Division 2, it's quantifiably bad. In like a 4v4, for example, you may be only covering 3, maybe 4 kilometers of front line, which is half the amount in 1v1s. But in that 3 to 4 kilometers of front line, you're still having the same amount of units, so in that small sector you have control of, there's much less room for actual maneuver warfare. And what doesn't help is that in these larger maps, there's arguably not as many flags as there should be. In a 1v1 map, if you look at the 50% line, there may be 6 to 8 flags roughly along that 50% line which you can contest. But in a team game, in your little sector, that same 50% line, there may only be 1, 2, maybe 3 flags that you have to contest over. So instead of having to split your forces over 8 different capture points, or 6, you're having to split up your forces in just 2. You send 50% of your force to one flag, and then 50% of your force to the other flag. And it just leads to this really boring head-on gameplay, where you just have your big blob of dudes fighting the enemy big blob of dude over one singular flag objective. And there's no room to maneuver because the maps are too small, the sectors are too small. It's really easy to defend in team games because of the amount of frontline coverage which is assigned to you. And in my personal experience of team games, it feels like I'm playing a World War I game with World War II units, as you can barely make any major breakthrough through the enemy line because it's too easy to set up a very strong and balanced defense. And also as well, with this sort of gameplay, you're pretty much encouraged to just take infantry spam and vetted, because everyone's going to die, and also just taking the heaviest armor tanks and artillery. And then artillery is a whole nother issue with team games. Now, of course, I mean, in team games, as we know, artillery is a very powerful tool. It's not so much in 1v1s. You know, in 1v1s, the artillery meta is right now just off-map artillery spam, because if you time off-map artillery effectively, you can suppress an entire town, then move in a half-track or some infantry to get everyone to surrender without too much bloodshed, apart from Ivan over here, who's been blown up to bits by a 380mm railgun. But in team games, because you have a smaller front line to defend, and it's easier to defend with less points, you can expend more point gen on getting backline support units, such as a strong anti-aircraft net, and of course artillery. And artillery is such a powerful tool in SD2, especially considering that most artillery guns can pretty much shoot entirely across the map, and if you set up artillery with radios, so you have accurate artillery fire across the map, you pretty much have, for the most part, an almost unkillable artillery park. I mean, yes, you can still counter battery, but it's very difficult when they're all arrayed in the back right corner, and your artillery is extremely inaccurate because you can't get an observer back, yeah. But also, because you're only fighting over 2 flags, it's fairly easy just to have a constant artillery barragement on both of those flags in your sector, and pretty much deny the enemy from pushing up. I've played countless 2v2s and 3v3s, where what's happened is I have an overwhelming frontline force on an objective, and I start pushing it, and I'm almost close to getting the flag, like it's just on the line. But then what happens is that the enemy has 4 to 5 howitzers in their backline, and then they start barraging, not directly my force, but just the capture point which I'm trying to capture. And because of the constant suppression and the high explosive dropping around all my guys, any sane person isn't going to want to go into that. But the artillery just keeps coming, and I can't really get an effective control over the flag. The enemy, in terms of frontline defenses, may have just a single anti-tank gun and 1 or 2 strokey squads in a forest just a little bit behind the artillery barrage, keeping the actual sector under their control. But it just turns into this monotonous gameplay, and you're just going to end up doing the same thing as well, because it's the easiest way to defend flags in team games. Now, I know that a lot of people who watch these videos probably play in team games, and I don't want to dunk on you. If you enjoy team games, yeah, that's completely fine. I do not want to take it away. I understand why people play team games. During War Game, I mainly played team games, because it's more fun to play with friends, first off. You have the knowledge of, you can have your friends back you up, which, you know, it's a little less stressful in 1v1s where everything really is your fault. But in the current state of things, I feel like team games would be a little bit better. Of course, they're never going to be the tactical, balanced gameplay I would consider 1v1s, and they don't have to be. But in the current state, most team games I notice usually go on for 40 to 50 minutes without any major, tactical breakthroughs or, entertaining gameplay from my part. It just feels like you're just chucking units in the middle. So here's a little bit of a hot take. I believe that SD2 has a less interesting deck building system compared to SD44. Now I know what you may be saying, Rang, you're a goddamn idiot. SD2 you have many more options in the deck building system. You can change the availability much more often, you can change the income, you can be very flexible with your divisions, you can build your Panzer as an A phase, B phase or C phase division. It's very open in that regard, and yes, you are correct in that regard. So I used to run this video series on my channel called the Steel Division Divisional Overview. For those who haven't seen it, it's essentially just a divisional overview guide of, I'd pick a division, I'd go over how to build that division in an effective 1v1 deck, and then show that division being played in a 1v1 match. I stopped doing that a few months ago. The reason being is that I felt like I was making the same video every single time. What I mean with this is that the game definitely feels like you're following the same cookie cutter template from Division to Division, because the game encourages one sort of gameplay option, and that is really a spamming option where you can last till the end of the game with an attritional warfare deck. And it's a shame because ST2 definitely has the potential to be a more interesting deck building game compared to ST44 with the amount of options that's available, but due to the current balance, you're pretty much focused into playing a specific array of every single division. And to showcase this, we are going to do a Steel Division 2 divisional overview right now, but not for any division in particular. So, welcome to a Steel Division 2 divisional overview. And today, we're going to take a look at how to build any division in a generic fashion. You follow these guidelines, which I'm going to set out, and you'll have an effective 1v1 division for the most part. So, let's begin. So to start off with, we got our income choices. Now, your income choice is really going to matter depending on what sort of game mode you're going to play. Your 1v1s and team game decks are for the most part different, but also the same. We'll get to that a little bit later. But for now, if you're going to play a 1v1, A phase and B phase is very important because it allows that initial positioning and you can get that initial momentum, but you still want stuff in C phase. So ideally, I'd recommend a flatline income or a Vanguard income. Maverick may seem like a good idea, but that C phase income is definitely pretty poor, and most 1v1s do last at least 20 to 30 minutes, so you do want some money coming in that time frame, especially if the game goes on longer. For team games, however, the match is definitely going to go to 40 minutes at least, unless you're doing a very good job. So, balanced income and juggernaut incomes are definitely advisable. So for recon, actually using recon to spot stuff is stupid. And I'm not saying this to be harsh, but currently with how the game is set up, recon has arguably very poor visibility, especially considering the large size of the maps and how it's very hard to sneak up recon units, especially across open field, to try to spot enemy anti-tank guns and scary tanks. So instead, your recon tab is essentially an extension of your infantry tab and your tank tab. For recon infantry, you just want to take stuff that can do lots of damage, such as sniper teams, dudes with bazookas, etc. And if you have a good recon tank, such as T-34s or some Panzer IVs or some cool armoured cars, definitely take them. Not for the reconnaissance aspect, but just for the added firepower. So infantry is a rather simple option. The most important infantry units in the game are your regular rifle troops, whether grenadiers, which aren't that great, Strelki, Guards, Commonwealth rifles, American rifles, insert Hungarian, Romanian, and Finnish regular rifle troops here as well. They're really going to make up the bread and butter, because infantry is really just about availability. You're not going to want to take veterancy for the most part here, guys. But your leaders are also very important. You don't need a ton of leaders, but you're definitely going to want enough to set up a good chain of command. And in terms of more CQC troops, such as shock troops, etc., SMGs currently, not very good. They have poor range and they get outmatched by flamethrowers and satchel charges, etc. So when you are getting CQC troops, you really just want guys with those satchel charges and flamethrowers. And for the most part, availability rise, you just want to have enough availability to get you through A and B phase, and then for the most part, you want a lot of C-phase cards. You always at least want one, maybe two C-phase cards of regular riflemen unvetted, so you can get 27 to 36 of them. So with tanks, there's really only two types of tanks that matter. The first one are your regular medium tanks, such as your Shermans, your Panzer IVs, your T-34, 76s, etc. They're very important because they're very good at close quarters, and they can deal with the majority of armoured threats at that range, and especially in 1v1 maps where there's quite a lot of close quarters areas, these guys will rule supreme. Light tanks may seem like a good option, but they're not a common option usually, and also they usually just get outclassed by the medium tanks in set engagements. Apart from that, you want the heaviest armoured tank that you can take always, such as your IS-2s, your Panthers, your Churchills, etc. Because in a long-range fight, it really just comes down to who has the biggest gun and who has the most armor, especially in team games where you're not really going to have an option to flank those heavy tanks, so you're just going to have to face them head on. So 21st Panzer is always a very good option. There's not much in the support tab that really matters. Machine gunners are pretty much outclassed by infantry support guns. If you can take 75, 76mm support guns, always, because they do a great job of fire support. Two-man flamethrower teams, especially in 1v1s, definitely a must, because in their fast transports, especially the Russian runs, you can get to the town or important infantry fighting positions before the regular infantry come and set up a good ambush. They require a little bit of micro, but those two-man flamethrower teams are very important. As well, commander. You always want at least an infantry commander. They're really the best one to get if you can take an infantry commander, especially in a 1v1. Even with the price nerf, they're still pretty much mandatory in a town fight. Anti-tank is a little bit more loosey-goosey. It really depends on how your tank tab is set up. For the most part, you always want to take some of the heaviest anti-tank guns that you can. And then you also want some of the lighter anti-tank guns, like your 45, 37 mils, because currently in ST2 ranges, they can hit at over 2 kilometers. Yes, they're not entirely accurate, but being able to do a lot of critical hits on medium tanks and kill light vehicles with those light anti-tank guns definitely helps out quite a bit, and they're very cheap. Most part, anti-tank infantry I find pretty useless. There are some uses for Panzer Strike Squads every now and again, but I usually find it just die too fast, and it's a little bit too hard to actually get them into range. Anti-air, it's pretty simple. You just want medium caliber anti-aircraft guns, such as 37 and 40 mils. If you're playing a team game, it might be a good idea to also throw some heavier anti-aircraft guns in as well. They're not good by themselves, as you do need a preset anti-aircraft net set up, but they do help out in knocking out some of the heavier bombers that may come your way. Now, artillery is very dependent on what sort of game mode you are going to be playing. If you're playing a 1v1, off-map artillery is a very good option. Apart from that, you just want to stick with mortars. In a team game, however, totally different. You want your howitzers, you want your big guns, you probably want some big off-map artillery if that's also an option to you. You may be thinking it might be a good idea to get some of the artillery infantry. The answer is just no. And lastly, we got the aircraft tab, which is definitely not that rigid in terms of what you need to take, as really the type of aircraft you're going to be taking is to really complement the weaknesses that you have in your ground game. If you don't have a lot of anti-tank, try taking some anti-tank planes. If you don't have a lot of anti-air, you definitely want fighters. Heck, really, you always want fighters, they're very good. If you don't have a lot of artillery, you might want some high explosive planes. But for the most part, if I can recommend a basic template, you always want maybe one card of A-phase and B-phase fighters, at least one card of B-phase anti-tank plane, preferably something with cluster bombs, and then maybe some cheaper high explosive bombers for just your odd infantry unit or anti-tank gun. And that is how you build a general deck in the current state of things in Steel Division 2. Of course, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. This isn't a strict guideline. Some divisions do play differently, where you're going to have to maybe take less anti-tank because you don't have that many anti-tank slots, etc. But for the most part, that's really all you have to follow to build an efficient deck. You can't really play a deck where you're actually using a lot of recon units to try and spot the enemy and then, call in artillery strikes or airstrikes, because recon's pretty useless. You're just using it to add extra firepower to your infantry and tanks, like I mentioned. I'm also not trying to say or make a point that every single division needs to be a special snowflake difference. I mean, especially with the Russian example. I mean, of course, the Russian division is going to feel a little bit more samey because they actually had a pretty structured chain of command and ordnance compared to the Germans in 1944. But it doesn't help out that with this rigid structure, which you have to follow right now, it does comprehend into the fact that you're going to have to, play the same ray every time, whether it's you're playing 44th Guard, 358th, 84th, 184th, etc. I also want to talk about the time limit in Steel Division 2. And this is, I feel like, is a little bit of a contentious topic. I don't have any firm stance on whether Steel Division 2 needs a time limit or not. Because there's really good arguments on both sides whether the game needs a time limit or not. But I want to bring up both points, and I'm going to let you at home decide your opinion on the matter. Heck, you probably already have an opinion on this. So, a reason for bringing back the time limit is that it stops games becoming a slow, monotonous slugfest that goes on to 40, 50, or 60 minutes, for example. As usually those matches aren't decided by, actually outmaneuvering your opponent, but more about who just brought more infantry or tanks to the fight and just win a slow attrition war. And due to the limited nature of your units in ST2, you're eventually going to run out of stuff. It's not like your traditional RTS game where you can keep churning out units from buildings and barracks, like in your Age of Empires or Company of Heroes, where there's an almost infinite resources. They do eventually run out, but in Steel Division 2, you're definitely encouraged with the known time limit, especially in team games, to just take an attritional warfare deck that doesn't really, worry about the first 20 minutes shows A and B phase, because C phase is gonna go on forever and ever and ever until one side eventually loses. Also, another argument for having time limits is that it allows you to block out your, real life time more effectively. The nice thing with previous games, such as War Game and SD44, is that a match is gonna last 40 minutes, and after that 40 minutes the match is done, and you can go and cook dinner or do your homework. Here, the match could potentially be 10 or 20 minutes, or it could go on for an hour. It's a little bit unpredictable. I feel like in the current trend of how strategy games are going, it's gonna be more insensitized to actually have RTS games which play shorter. Like RTS games that only go on for 20 to 25 minutes. Tooth and Tail is a pretty good example where you can still have the tactical strategic gameplay that RTS games offer, but in a smaller, more easier package where you can just quickly jump in, play a 20-minute match, and if you lose, you can go play another quick 15 or 20-minute match. It's one of the reasons why card games, like those computer card games, are very popular, because they're very fast and it's very easy to just get into the next run, the next run, and the next run. However, if you remember SD44, the time limit in that game was a big hindrance, as it really encouraged you to play in a completely different aspect in SD2, where rest divisions, which have good A phase and B phase income and units, are pretty much prioritized over your C phase income divisions, because those first 20 minutes of the match are very important in terms of general positioning and setting up the momentum for the match. And usually your C-phase divisions, once the 20-minute mark's hit and you got that high income and you can roll out the Panthers off the factory line, it's usually too late to really make any major impact. And you might as well just have, surrendered at that 25-minute mark once you realize you don't have enough time to actually make a comeback. And the ability to pretty much lose the game before it's over due to a time limit can feel very annoying, because maybe if you just had an extra 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, things would have turned out very differently. This is a debate that I personally go over with myself quite a bit, because I don't really have a clear stance on either side. They both bring up very good points. But I don't know. That's my real opinion on this. Oh no, this is something I would like to talk about in the comments down below or on my Discord, because I think it's really good arguments for both sides here. I mean, having at least the option in SD2 for time limit would be nice, but whether it be a mandatory option, whether it be the standard, that's a whole other ball game. And those are pretty much most of the points that I do want to cover. But there's one last thing I want to talk about, which Nilla brought up in his video, and a question that I've been thinking about and talking with some friends of mine. Is Steel Division 2 a simulator game, or is it an arcade game? In my personal opinion, my quick answer, it's slap bang in the middle of being both. It's neither, full-on Company of Heroes 2, but it's also neither Gravity and Tactics. It's right down the center. And I think being right down the center is definitely a hindrance for the game, as they've definitely went a little bit more towards the realism aspect in SD2 compared to previous games of the Army General mode and the tank penetration mechanics. But at the same time, you still have the arcadey gameplay of how general units interactions and how all the Army General battles are pretty much just multiplayer or single-player bot skirmishes, but with gimmicks of not having anti-tank or anti-air because you don't have an anti-tank or anti-air battalion nearby. And a good point that Nilla also made in this video is that Eugene needs to figure out what they want to be, because he can't really be both, because you just piss off both sides. On one hand, you have people who are expecting this to be an arcade game, like a Company of Heroes, who pick it up, and then they see all these tank penetration mechanics and all these long and detailed systems, and then they just get annoyed. And then you get people who pick it up expecting to play Gravity Tactics, and then they see that it's much more arcadey, and you got the whole surrender mechanic, and you got HP bars and infantry in array, and they just get annoyed either. So, in my personal opinion, the games have probably become a little bit more arcadey in comparison. The previous games in the series, such as your Raw games and SD44, were definitely more arcadey and simulatorish. They focused on the gameplay first rather than trying to be an accurate simulator. I think a very good thing that Steel Division 2 does is not so much having, one-to-one simulation accuracy in terms of unit statistics, but more in terms of the fronts and battles that they cover. Because the best thing in Steel Division 2 are the goddamn divisions. It is such a cool and unique system that they've added that no real World War II RTS game does, because every single World War II RTS game, you're essentially just playing as the entire country with all the units available to you. When in reality, how the order of battle is structured, everyone's in divisions. Tank divisions have their pros and cons. Infantry divisions have their pros and cons. And Steel Division 2 has well over 50 divisions right now, which is a lot of variety for the players. And it allows Eugene to focus on these cool historical battles which are much less covered in usual World War II media. I mean, what other, tactical RTS game like this allows you to play as Canadians fighting Romanians in Finland? The answer is really not that many. And I think if the game focused on actually having more funner, less in-depth mechanical gameplay that's a little bit more easier to pick up, but still have the general divisional structure, which definitely doesn't make it feel like a simulator game, but definitely makes it feel a little bit more authentic when, you're playing a Panzer division, you've got Panzers and infantry and half-tracks, or you're playing a, reserve line division like Korok, where you just kind of have to make do with what you got. That's the cool part of SD2. Not trying to simulate, accurate tank ranges and suppression, etc. I didn't really talk about any particular unit stats in this video, as frankly I don't think that's the major issue with the game, whether, something needs to be 5 points more or less, or this machine gun does too much damage. It really comes down to this general aspect of, well, first off, the game is spam, but secondly, and this final point I'm making, the game's trying to be a simulator, it's trying to be an arcade game, and it can't do both well. It does both rather poorly compared to previous installments. But that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about in terms of general balance in the game. If you stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you very much. This is something I've been wanting to get off my chest for quite a while now, and I'm wanting to use this video as a discussion point about these problems, because they've really been in the game since release, really, and I think something needs to change, especially now considering that Eugene's going to spend a year or two continuing with SD2 and with the new Nemesis DLCs, which I'm really looking forward to, because they're going to add some cool stuff. I hope you guys voted for Evolve. We all need elephants. But, yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of this part of the video. I do want to talk about just the general direction of my channel just after, yes, but you don't have to stick around for that, obviously, and honestly I don't blame you if you don't want to. So yeah, I'm going to talk about my channel now, so if you want to leave, you should click off now. Thanks for sticking by. Okay, they gone now? Good, they're a little bit weird. Like I said, this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while now, because as you might interpret from what I'm saying, I don't like the game that much, and you would be right. The previous times I've had actually tried to sit down and play the game, frankly I've hated it. I've just left frustrated more than anything. And I don't want to leave frustrated, because I generally want to sit down and play and enjoy this game more often, but I frankly haven't played a proper game of this in a few months now, heck, a few weeks at least. And frankly, on a personal level, this is going to sound a little bit dramatic, but I feel a little bit like I got imposter syndrome, because I do all these casts and I try to keep up to date with the balance of the game, but I don't feel like I really deserve to be in the position I am if I'm not actually actively playing the game, and if I also actively dislike and how the game is currently set up. I do like casting, and I do like doing Unit of the Weeks. I'm not saying this is my resignation letter and you're never going to hear from me ever again. The regular video content is still going to come out. I love doing the co-cast with Khan. Units of the Weeks are always fun, and I mean, I've been doing them for almost 6 years now. It'd be kind of stupid to stop here. I'm slightly not enjoying the game. But it made me feel like I felt a bit like a piece of shit for a little bit because of this. I want to talk about the general balance and stuff and my feelings, but I feel like with, you know, me kind of putting my heart in the sleeve in this video and talking about my thorough dislike of this game in its current state, I don't know, I just feel like a bit of a hypocrite. And it sucks, because I really want to have more community engagement in terms of playing the game. I'd love to have nights where, you know, just on a Discord or play some 4v4s just for fun. But I just cannot play the game. I hate playing it. It drives me up the wall. Every time I've tried to play a team game with, like, a buddy of mine in a 2v2, it just becomes this, like, monotonous artillery spam where nothing really interesting happens. And I want to do this cool tactical maneuver gameplay and try to actually have, you know, interesting engagements where I'm setting up ambushes and maneuvering around flanks. But it's not like that. The game isn't like that. It feels like I'm just playing the same match every single time. The same thing happened with the campaign. When the game first came out, I had my campaign series. I did 3 of the campaigns of the initial campaigns on release. And then I just stopped doing it. The reason I stopped doing the campaigns is, once again, with the divisional overview videos, I felt like I was just making the same video every time. Especially towards the end of the 3rd campaign. Pretty much most of the battles would I'd set up a German infantry battalion in the forest. The map would be shell. I'd have 2 like Pack 40 bunkers and some Pack 38 bunkers. AI opponent, because it's a small 1v1 map, would only have like 2 or 3 choke points to move 100 T-30-45s, and then the bunkers would just blow everything up. The campaign has definitely gotten better since I've last played it. They've done a pretty good job in UI tweaks and general balance tweaks. But it still feels like, from what I've, you know, tried to play a little bit, it still just feels like you're playing just bot matches, like regular skirmish, like single-player matches, but with limitations. And the gimmicks can be cool, but it just drives me up the wall. Frankly, I have no idea why I'm explaining all of this. I just really want to get it out here, because this has been driving me, like, a little bit emotionally crazy. No, I'm not, like, depressed or anything. I'm doing fine. I mean, considering there's a whole pandemic going on, I could be in a much worse position, personally speaking. But things are great. Like, I'm fine. Like, nothing's stopping. The channel's still going on with your regular scheduled programming. I think just for now, I mean, I'm still going to do the cast and all of that. I want to try doing just some side content eventually down the road. It's not going to interfere with the regular cast or Units of the Weeks. That will still be the same, but just something a little bit added on. As I'd like to just try some other things for... Just for fun. And me and Khan have been talking about this for a few weeks now. There's some games that we'd like to try and cover on our channels, just to break things up. I mean, if you don't like the games, you don't have to watch it. Once again, regular scheduled programming will be continuing as normal. But in terms of this little personal part of the channel, if you've actually sat through and listened to this, I really want to thank you. It's just, I don't know anymore. I do like this channel. I really enjoy the community and the stuff that I've built over the years with this YouTube. I just wish Steel Division 2 was a better game right now. I think Eugene's on the right track into fixing these issues, but considering, you know, it's been like over a year since the game's just felt like the same game without much fun. Like, I just haven't been having fun, which makes me a sad panda, which is a terrible joke. Anyway, I'm actually going to shut up now, and this video will officially end. So, thank you for watching, and as usual, guys, please just take it easy.